Hello and welcome into the Make Your Research Matter podcast, brought to you by Repo, the #1 research repository for software companies looking to centralize research data and democratize access to research findings and insights throughout your organization. I'm your host, John Fontenot, and on today's episode, I have on Teresa Cain. Teresa is the Director of Product and User Experience at the fintech company TreviPay. She's also the author of Solving Problems in 2 Hours. She's a LinkedIn top voice on product management and a winner of the Top 40 Under 40 award. Needless to say, Teresa does a lot. I had so much fun talking to Teresa about how she got into product, the inspiration for her book, how to actually solve problems in 2 hours, and which problems work best for the 2-hour design sprint methodology, and the trends across product and UX as it relates to research. It was super fascinating to hear Teresa's perspective as a product leader who leads not only the PM org at TreviPay, but also the UX function. You're in for a treat, and I can't wait for you to hear what Teresa had to say. Hey, Teresa, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, John.
Yeah, absolutely. So to kick things off for the listeners who may not know you, may not have read the book yet, could you give me just a brief background on yourself, how you got into product management, and then we can start talking about the book in just a moment.
I'd love to. So I've been in the product and technology space for a little over 15 years, and that's across B2B and B2C. And I've actually been working for fintech called TreviPay for the last 6 years, where I'm over product management, user experience, and design. And part of really what drove me into product management was being a customer. So I actually got my start back at H&R Block years ago, and one of my first tasks in product was to do my taxes. And every single tax product available as we built, some brand new solutions for the web. And ever since then, I've stuck with it, and here I am today.
Awesome, very cool. So I guess when I talk to a lot of people who've been in product for a while, a lot of times they say they fell into it. Was product management something that you kind of fell into, or is it something that you saw from the outside looking in and said, "Man, I really want to do that"? How did that origin story kind of come about?
So it's funny. So no, I had no idea what product management was when I got into it. So I mean, this would have been like, circa 2005, 6, 7, right? So it was interesting. That was a time like right before, the mortgage collapse happened, in 2008. And so I was fortunate enough where I was really avid on internships. So I had like 7 internships in college. So I kind of knew exactly I wanted to be in a business role. And I majored in 2 undergraduate degrees, English with technical writing and editing, and then journalism. So I've always been a writer. And I started editing HTML, and that's what got me the job at H&R Block. And I guess they liked how I edited HTML because it kind of led me into from writing tax articles on their website, taxcut.com, for H&R Block, into the product world, because I started kind of talking to customers and getting feedback. And I implemented a software solution that's really big in text analytics today called Clara Bridge, where I was getting a lot of customer feedback and working with NPS even way back then. So that's kind of how I got my start. And they said, "Hey, you want to come over to the product side?" And I was like, "Sure." And the rest is history. And for H&R Block, at the time, TurboTax, it was coming in as their biggest competitor. So it was quite the ride and experience in developing new features for H&R Block. So
Very cool. It's an awesome story. So I'm, as a product person myself, I'm very passionate about user experience and research, and I get the feeling that you're in the same boat, right? Because the book that you wrote, Solving Problems in 2 Hours, um, basically doing a 2-hour design sprint. I read the Google book sprint, which takes a whole week, and I know they talk about how hard it is to get buy-in sometimes that way. So whenever I saw the book, and I'm like, man, if we can get this done in 2 hours, that would be huge. So I'm curious from your standpoint, what what drove you to write the book? What was the opportunity that you saw? And then I really want to dig into like how to pull this off in 2 hours. It's very
yeah.
fascinating.
So with the 5-day process, that was something I had been reducing down to a couple days for a few years. So Jake Knapp and the team at Google, they started their research in 2010. The book came out in 2016, which I certainly read. The company I worked for at the time adopted it. Companies after I worked for adopted it. And I think, as a product practitioner, not every company has the same level of investment in UX and research. And so oftentimes that role is getting put on the product manager. And with the book Sprint, a lot of what was recommended at the time and what a lot of technology organizations were doing was hiring third parties, spending thousands of dollars to come in and run these 5-day sprints where you have an outside expert telling you what to run even though you have a room of subject matter experts, you have a third party coming in, running this process and telling you how to go solve your problems. And that never really sit right with me. Wasn't always a fan. Saw a lot of money leave out of my budget in terms of that. I mean, thousands of dollars, sometimes upwards of like $100,000, $200,000 for these contracts where you're bringing a company in to run a couple a year. And so I had already kind of brought it in internal and had been running design sprints on my own as a product practitioner, not always having the UX and design team. Some organizations I worked for certainly did have it, and that operated out of there, but not everyone did. And so the opportunity that really came about, we were already a little bit of a hybrid organization. TreviPay has offices in the Netherlands, in Costa Rica, in Australia. So we already have a lot of global teams that we're working with. But when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, everyone went remote. And it's amazing to think this was 4 years ago. Like the research for this book ultimately happened, 4 or 5 years ago at this point. But really what happened is you have a situation where you're constantly, trying to solve problems for customers and internally. And being in the fintech space, I know you've also been in the fintech space. It's a crazy market. When I started at TreviPay almost 6 years ago, we had 5 key competitors in the space. And today, I've got a spreadsheet of 55 competitors that are, kind of eating into the B2B market here. And so it's really critical to not just problem solve, but to able to do it quickly and efficiently. So you don't really want to lose the quality by going to a 2-hour process. But if you are scheduling your problems for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months out, because that's what your budget allows for later in the year, then you're really missing an opportunity to get ahead of a problem and get something out the door before a competitor. So that's really how the concept came about, was just a little bit of trial and error with me running it. It started off as a 4-hour process. And then from an engagement standpoint, I landed on 2 hours, and I've got the teams running around probably around like 40 to 50 2-hour design sprints a year. And then I've also had the opportunity to coach organizations around the globe doing the same.
That's awesome. So the first thing that comes to my mind is like, how do you pull that off? And I would imagine there has to be, in a similar way that like dev teams vertically slice work into kind of small atomic units, I would imagine that these 2-hour design sprints are the same, where they're very focused and like pointed. Is that the case? Or like how expansive can you get in this design sprint in that 2-hour window?
Yeah, so how I really like to separate it. So I'm obviously a huge fan of design sprints altogether. So I still think there is a time and place for a 5-day design sprint where you're running a complex problem. You're not going to solve a complex problem in 2 hours, let's be honest. So certainly that is the framework that this 2-hour process is modeled off of which that framework is modeled off of design thinking, which is, could take months to years where you're researching, kind of like a PhD for the most part. So for the 2-hour process, how I like to separate out the problems is really, here's the key benefits of it. So really the challenge is a lot of organizations are trying to get a room of stakeholders together and get alignment to move forward on an initiative. And that could be a feature that you have going in a product. That could be a problem that's going on in your organization. This could be something that's sitting on your backlog or a client request. So these are the types of problems that I usually bring into this process to be able to deliver on in 2 hours. And, as an internal team, so we actually have 27 engineering teams at TreviPay. So, we're not doing this for every feature, but we're doing this for quite a bit of features where we kind of have an idea of where we want to move forward with this feature, but we really want to get consensus and get further brainstorming on it and kind of all come to the same agreement on a solution. And what's interesting is I have run a number of initiatives where I've run a 5-day or multi-day versus a 2-hour, and we've come out with similar solutions during it. So that's really how I was able to prove out whether or not this method would work. But again, it doesn't work for complex problems. I like to do small or medium problems. And if I chunk out larger problems, what I'll do is a series of 2-hour design sprints with that.
Very cool. So I guess very like tangibly and practically, can you give an example of what one of those 2-hour design sprints look like?
Yeah. So let's just say you are trying to build a new dashboard, and you know that maybe you have a dashboard for a certain subset of users. You have an admin role, you have an analyst role, and you have this new role. You have an executive role where your concept is you think an executive is going to go log into this dashboard. So this is where you would create a new 2-hour design sprint. You would have kind of that foundation of research of already having a dashboard for other user personas, and then you would dive into this executive persona. So this would be an opportunity where if I look at my stakeholder list, I'm not only bringing in, product managers, a designer, an engineer, but I'm probably going to bring in a subset of executive stakeholders to better understand, hey, how are they going to be using this great dashboard idea we have? And having run several of these with dashboards specifically, what I'll learn is they're probably not going to log into the dashboard. You probably need a mobile app or a quick login where they're able to check because they don't have the capacity to go to a website. So ultimately what you're doing as a group is you're walking through what you know, what products you have available. You're getting stakeholder feedback directly in the room. And what I find when you have a great stakeholder mix, especially if you're able to pull in who the end user would be for something like this, where you have an executive, you're able to get that iterative feedback during the 2-hour process so that when that solution comes about, you're able to execute on that solution together.
Awesome. One of the hardest things that I've experienced when doing like the 5-day design sprint is lining up the timing of customer availability with the end of the sprint to like test and validate or invalidate what we're designing. Um, it- how much is the 2-hour sprint reliant on internal stakeholders, and how much do you see like customer involvement, or like where does that fall into the process?
And that's really the big separation between a 5-day process and a 2-hour process is the testing and prototyping are done outside of that. And part of that differentiator during a 5-day method, even if you are unsure whether you have the right solution, you're spending another 2 days testing and getting the prototype ready and then testing with customers and assuming you have the right stakeholders, and it's kind of a rush process, whoever shows up type of scenario, which is some of the challenges I had in the past. With the 2-hour process, you are making the decision as a team whether or not you think you should move forward to that next stage of prototyping and testing. And that's really a key differentiator from a time standpoint. So I have run a number of 5-day and multi-day design sprints where we went through the process. We were unsure whether we had the right solution, put it in front of customers, and they said, well, this is awful. This is not what we're going to use. And we had to throw it out the door and go back, all over again and do the process again. So that's really what it's meant to do is, hey, get a group together, get to the same conclusion you were going to get to in 5 days, in 2 hours, and make that decision whether you want to invest more time in prototyping and testing afterwards.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So one of the things that I heard is that like typically the 2-hour design sprint is for like smaller initiatives or like smaller chunks of work. The 5 days for something larger. Are there any other heuristics of like when you should use the 2-hour design sprint versus the 5-day?
Yeah, so I think some of the other differences of when to use it. I mean, I really am sparingly using 5-day or multi-day. And the reality is there's a lot of changing dynamics. I talked about the changes going on in fintech alone, where it's a saturated market now. So I mean, I really think times have changed. There was a time when design thinking where you would spend months to years. There's a time period for that. There's a time period for spending 5 days. And I think we're in a time period now. I mean, look generationally, you have the millennial generation, you have the Gen Z generation coming into the market. They're not going to spend 5 days researching a problem. Getting them to spend 2 hours, is challenging getting engagement in it. So making sure that we're keeping up with the times, and organizations beyond the roles of individuals that have the time also don't have that time to waste. They need to have the ability to run and problem solve faster. And it's not even just about putting out new features in the market, but also really, how do you get a team together to innovate and be creative and get alignment in one room and get that buy-in? You look at the amount of hybrid organizations today, you have a mixture of remote employees, in-person employees, and hybrid. This process really allows you to bring together a group of individuals from anywhere, whether in person, remote, around the world, and have them come to a consensus quicker, so you don't have any blockers for your organization.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And I think you're right? Like the up and coming generation, the generation that's coming into the workforce, even as much as millennials got talked about with attention spans and, and whatnot, I think it's just getting worse with things like short form video, with like Reels and TikTok. It's like attention spans are shorter. But I think outside of that, you made a good point around like the benefit of everyone's time, right? Like meetings get expensive. Tech tech salaries are not small, right? So meetings can get expensive. You get a bunch of people in a room, which I think the 5 day sprint calls for a very long time. So it's an expensive process. So if you can quickly iterate through a 2 hour process, it serves the people within your company. So it helps culturally, but it also saves a ton of money and time and makes you more iterative. So I really like that.
Yeah, and I think, even beyond the time saving, I'm really big on doing surveys after workshops, and just even the workshop participation and happiness of the customer from doing the processes is different as well. And that's really going to change, the engagement level. You can get a group of people to commit to 2 hours and get excited and stay engaged, but keeping that engagement for 5 days, you see people, you say no phones, no laptops, great. Well, they're just going to leave. They're just going to say, sorry, I've got a critical meeting. I'm going to pop out for a few hours and I'll pop back in. And I think you touched on, an interesting point as well. So you look at the social media apps, that are really, striking and bearing the market right now, where you have all these attention span moments of short videos and short processes. And so if you think about it, it doesn't mean it's going to be forever, but right now this is a time that we're in, and you only have a short amount of time to get the attention of stakeholders. So utilize that time. You don't have 5 days anymore. You have maybe 2 hours. I've been running workshops that were even an hour since I run this process out with organizations and internally at TreviPay, mainly because of that. People just don't have the time or the attention span.
Yeah, it's so true. So Teresa, as we start to wrap up here, one question that I like to ask all my guests is, how do you make research matter more? And I'll couch it by saying that as we started the discussion, a lot of companies don't place a lot of inherent value on research or even on the practice of design, right? I think it's often underutilized and underappreciated. So from your experience, what are like one or two things that you've seen that helps, um, I guess, socialize or evangelize, improve the value of research and user experience throughout the organization?
Yeah, that's I love this topic, and I love that you brought this question up. So I have worked for organizations that invested heavily. So I say first and foremost, a huge investment. What's interesting is there was a Nielsen Norman report that worked for organizations where I was years ago, before the COVID pandemic, that was saying that we needed this user experience. We need this beyond the product management. The role of user experience and just that area of expertise in general was going to exponentially grow over the next 50 years, like doubling, quadrupling, beyond anything. So I'd be interested to see if they adjust that report to see if that's still the case with COVID. But similar to, product and technology firms, when a layoff happens, and we're seeing quite a bit of layoffs still happening, even off from the last couple of years, what I'm seeing going next are these UX and design roles, and some of that is being put on product managers. And so I think, the biggest challenge in advocating for research is making sure that you are not only coupling together why it's needed, but trying to show the value of those departments, which the biggest value and asset that having and investing in user experience and research is, it's really all about the customers. there's already so much on a product manager's plate. I know in past times it's been called, the mini CEO, right? So in past times, as a product manager, you are managing every stakeholder relationship, and you should absolutely know what your customer is saying. But you also need to have validation, including additional research. So whether that's a focus group or a survey or just spending time on site at different customer sites, that's not something that product managers are going to be able to go do and then write up, a 30-page report and make recommendations off of, because there's so much to do managing a day in the life with your engineering team, with stakeholders across the org, if they own the P&L, if they're a sales-driven product manager. So this is really where that importance is it really allows you to understand your customers, because if you don't, they're just going to find another solution that understands them better. So that's really the investment in the pitch, is making sure that you have a good ratio of UX researchers to product managers. So in an ideal world, I'd like to have, one UX researcher, for every 3 product managers. We've got around 30 product managers at TreviPay, so we've got around 5 to 6 UX research/design roles. So that's really a good, healthy mix that allows you to not only validate what the customer is saying, but then validate that through design work as well.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think too many companies, too many executives still see design as this like visual UI only element, and miss the whole full stack nature of what UX is, and research, and yes, design, but also validation and interaction design. Like it's a whole robust discipline in and of itself. And it's always great talking to other like-minded product people who care deeply and evangelize the practice of UX, because it's a critical component. And to your point, we don't have time to do it as PMs.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's funny. I mean, you could think something as simple as, a forgot password. So maybe you have a forgot password link, but it's buried on the page, and you didn't do any UX research, you didn't do any of that, you didn't invest in it, and now you're getting negative reviews in the App Store. So it's something as simple as that could have been solved through UX research. You could have gone in front of customers. You could have said, hey, where would you expect to go if you were wanting to click a forgot password link on a login screen? And that would have saved, reviews, negative reviews. It would have saved, a lot of money in the long run. So usually applying it to situations like that within the product really allows the executive team to have that buy-in. And I feel like it's come a long way. I think a lot of organizations understand the value and understand that separation from product, but there's still a lot of ways to go to really build that brand further.
Totally. And to evangelize the fact that how much, sales and marketing is impacted by UX, right? Like from a brand perspective, if things look outdated or there's like funky patterns, it looks like it's not a good product, right? And so that hurts sales. It hurts brand, because you don't have UX copy consistency. The way you talk about things on the website don't match how you actually talk about it in the product. So
Right.
It's interesting how much we talk about alignment in the product practice, and how much there needs to be alignment across how we drive people to our website, how sales talks to it, and how the product actually talks to the customer within the product, and how much those need to be aligned, and how much UX kind of plays that glue role in making sure those things are consistent.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Well, Teresa, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. If somebody wants to find your book, I know they can go get it, Solving Problems in 2 Hours. It's on Amazon. Anywhere else that they can go find it?
Yeah, it should be everywhere. At this
Awesome.
point, Barnes and Noble, it's a little bit everywhere. And then I've also got the website, 2hourdesignssprints.com.
Awesome. Well, go check out the website. Teresa, if somebody wants to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Big on LinkedIn. I love following and also following others, learning from others on LinkedIn. So find me on LinkedIn, or also on Twitter at Design with T. Cain. And I also am in the Fig Jam community as well, if you look up at Teresa Cain.
Awesome. Well, Teresa, thanks so much for coming on. That was a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for having me, John.
If you're tired of duplicative research efforts or losing research files from customer interviews and the endless mess of poorly organized files and folders, check out Repo, the #1 research repository for software companies who want to make their research matter. Research shouldn't be siloed between departments. It should be accessible broadly throughout your organization. If you and your company can benefit from alignment on strategy, prioritization, and decision making, try out Repo at researchrepo.com. Link in the show notes.